Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome back to the Uncut Network. Every month we rotate between directors, actors, and super specific genres, covering everything from exploitation to things your parents will absolutely approve of, relative unknowns to household names, and everything in between. The Uncut Network is the movie podcast with all of the niches, and to cover all of those things and more, I am joined by Graham. Hello there.
Hello, Rob.
And learning my lesson and doing it a different way this time, because I don't want somebody new to be upstaged entirely. Jimmy, first time on the podcast. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I know Vincent has something prepared here, so that's why I've done him last. So Vincent, I'm joined by Vincent last of all.
I put my career in second place throughout my podcasts, and it suffered. I don't regret it. You make choices. If you want a good podcast, you must pay attention to that. If you want to be independent, go ahead. You can't have it all. Hello, I'm Vincent, and that was a quote from a very famous lady, with some modifications.
Yes, we'll introduce who that is. If you know already, well, you've probably just looked at the episode title, frankly, so that kind of takes a bit of the mystery out of it. But how are you all today?
I'm good. My sleep patterns have been interesting, unpredictable, full of surprises, but I feel pretty good at the moment.
Well, I can't speak for anybody else, but for a while I had a flock of starlings that kept on waking me up at 5 o'clock. And the thing about starlings is there's not one or two or even five. There's about 7,000 of them at once. So whenever they were in the garden, yes. That was always like a fun little sort of quirk. Everybody else good though? We're all rosy?
Yeah. Not today's pretty good. Can't complain.
That actor...
I was okay until this can of Dr. Pepper decided to spray slightly. It's like, I have not shaken you up. What is going on? So I might be attacked by carbonated drinks. Who knows?
Other drinks are available, but frankly, if you want to sponsor me, Dr. Pepper, I'd say, yeah, okay, I'll take that bullet.
Of course. I mean, to my knowledge, Dr. Pepper are not currently sponsoring the Geek Show, but I dare say you wouldn't turn them down.
Oh, no, absolutely not. But to loop round to the intro, we say there's different types of movies, exploitation, things your parents will love, and this week it's a things your parents will love, because it is Lauren Bacall, following sort of a double, really, this past month for this theme, because last time was Gregory Peck. So, yeah, Lauren Bacall, what are our feelings on this screen icon? Jimmy?
Yeah, she's someone that I didn't know, like, I obviously know Lauren Bacall really well, but, like, when I looked at her filmography, I realised, like, a little bit underseen on my behalf. So, like, quite well, like pretty familiar with a lot of the other stars of this era. But one of the, like, joys of wanting to come on here was a chance to sit down and, you know, watch a couple of her films and then, like, inevitably do a bit more of a deep dive later on. So it's quite nice to come in not super knowledgeable at everything. It kind of leaves a lot of room to, like, get excited about what everyone else has to say and learn a bit. So yeah, I've really enjoyed the three films, and wish I could have squeezed in a few more, to be honest.
Very diverse three, I'd hazard to say as well. Yeah.
Definitely.
Vincent, yourself. Lauren Bacall feelings.
I think the very first time I heard the name Lauren Bacall was actually in Billy Crystal's opening number at the 69th Annual Academy Awards, which was when she received her first, and I believe only, Oscar nomination for, I don't remember what the film was. Was it The First Wives Club? Something like that. So yeah, that was the first time that I'd heard of her. And as times went on, funnily enough, I came across her more. During my undergrad degree, I took, no, I'm wrong, I think it was The Mirror Has Two Faces she was nominated for. Yes, that's right. But during my undergraduate degree, I took a course on film noir. And when you do film noir, you're kind of inevitably going to come across, and I'm sure we'll talk about this chappie, Humphrey Bogart. And closely connected with Humphrey Bogart is, of course, Lauren Bacall, as they starred together several times and indeed were married. But in terms of actual movies of hers I'd seen, very few. I had seen The Big Sleep, and I had seen Dark Passage, both of which she starred in with Bogart. But other than that, I don't think, looking over her filmography, no, I hadn't seen other things that she had been in. And tell a lie, I had also seen Misery, and she is in that briefly. But
She is.
yes,
Yeah.
and I had also seen, she's in My Fellow Americans, which I saw on a plane long ago. So I remember seeing the film, but I don't remember her being in it. But it's interesting to look at her in her later years. Obviously, we're recording this in 2014. She died 10 years ago. But it's interesting to see the things she did in later life, such as My Fellow Americans. I had also seen her in Dogville, and I had heard her in Howl's Moving Castle, the English version. But considering the extent of her career, that is barely scratching the surface. So
Yes.
preparing for this and looking at some of the films that we'll be discussing tonight has been something of an education for me as well.
Indeed. And Graham, yourself?
Yeah, I'm going to Frankenstein some bits together from Jimmy and Vincent's answers there, because I recognised a lot in that. I think I definitely had an impression of who Lauren Bacall was. I was definitely familiar with certain parts of her work. Like Vincent, I did a course on film noir at university. It was it was kind of a formative experience to me, because these were the first times I was really encouraged to look at a great old film and take it apart and, say what the shot composition means and things like this, rather than just passively watching the film and seeing whether it had a good story or not. So, of course, you end up watching things like The Big Sleep and Dark Passage, and I was certainly familiar with that stage of her career. And around that time also, she was having that remarkable late life sort of run of roles in things like Dogville, as you say, several other films, one of which we will get onto. So I was familiar with her as a sort of the American equivalent of a theatrical dame, as someone who would come on and instantly bring a bit of extra class and history to modern films. And when you see someone at the beginning of their career, because she was like only about 19 when she started off in the early noirs, and when you see someone, in the later years of her life, you think, well, I know that person, but of course this elides about 50 years of screen career in between. And yeah, it's been really interesting looking at that and realising how many other Lauren Bacalls there are that I wasn't familiar with.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that the stuff, really, Graham, because it's just the idea of British institutions, all of our acting institutions, have heavy histories in theatre. Their origins, tread the boards, everything that they need to become the actor that they are. America doesn't really have that. They have Broadway, of course, they have Broadway, but it's
a very specialised thing, isn't it? Broadway, it's its own little world. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't have that same sort of symbiosis between theatre and screen.
Well, I think there is an element of that, but it's less publicised. I mean, you can read about actors who get there, who do start off in theatre, not necessarily Broadway, like they might be doing theatre in Los Angeles, and then they get picked up for television or film work as well. I know, bit off topic straight away, didn't take long, but I remember reading that Jessica Chastain was doing theatre in Los Angeles and then was getting the odd bit part in TV, and then auditioned for a production of Salome, stage production, which turned out to be directed by and featuring Al Pacino, and her career got a boost from that. So yeah. But I know what you mean. We don't get the sense, but I've no idea if Lauren Bacall, for instance, did any theatre acting before going into cinema. And of course, many will in later decades will start out in TV. But yeah, to look to those who were acting back in the 40s and earlier, it's something that warrants research.
It's a very different landscape of pop culture in America to the UK, I think. And it's these historical names. It's a harsh way of putting it for old people, but I'm going to roll with it. It's drawn into light with that. Anywho, the 3 movies that we are doing today, we're going to be starting off with 1948's Key Largo, 1956's Written on the Wind, and 2004's directed by the man who's done the most erotic flake commercial in the history of flake commercials, Jonathan Glazer, with Birth.
Google it. Google Jonathan Glazer unaired flake commercial, listeners. If you don't know this, it's breathtaking.
It's Dennis Levant as the devil. So
yes,
flouncing up some stairs.
It could be an outtake from Holy Motors. He could have made an extra stop in that limousine and got out and done this.
As a complete aside, that Jonathan Glazer Devil advert obviously influenced so many people. It is definitely the reason I had my worst ever day when I worked in casting. I did a casting job where someone was trying to do that advert again, and I had to stand in as like the target of the devil. I love Jonathan Glazer, but that is the worst day of my life, and I blame him wholly for that. But I loved Birth, so at least I can,
that's wonderful.
Storm's passing.
Torn shutter or two, some trash on the beach. A few hours of a little to remind you of what happened tonight.
Will we ever see you again, Frank?
Yeah, the storm. It's passing.
Will we?
I hope so.
Why don't you stay right on here with us, Frank? You're most welcome. Go on, tell him, Nora. If he decides to stay here with us, we'd be most happy. Go on, tell Frank.
Have you any folks?
No.
I'd be proud to have you regard us as your family.
Maybe that isn't what Frank wants.
Oh, I don't mean to set on you, son. Think it over. Don't give your answer right away.
Hey, boss! Hey, boss!
What's that?
The boat's gone!
Huh? Bring everything down. The soldier stuff, too. Oh, soldier, give her out for hand. Coming with us? Yes or no? I'm in a hurry. Let's go to work on her. You win. I thought you'd change your mind the last minute. Well, what's the damage, old man? Well, that ought to take care of it. Want to come along, sister?
We're going to start this off chronologically. So that means 1948, Key Largo, directed by John Huston, big name. So who wants to have a crack at synopsizing this, which I thought was a film noir, but not quite classic?
Can I wait for my synopsis, because I've not got much for the first 2 films? Okay. I'm going to hold out, sorry.
I can give a synopsis for Key Largo. All right, well, I'll start with the synopsis summary on the IMDb, which is: a man visits his war buddy's family hotel and finds a gangster running things. As a hurricane approaches, the two end up confronting each other, which is actually, I think, quite an apt description, because what we get in Key Largo is we start with a war veteran, played by Humphrey Bogart, Frank McCloud. He's on a bus. He's traveling through Florida. But before that starts, actually, we do get a screen crawl which tells us the southernmost point of the United States is the Florida Keys, connected by these long bridges, which I think it's important not only in terms of telling us where we are, and that the southernmost of all is Key Largo, not only telling us where we are geographically, but also it helps to set the kind of the tone and the mood as well. Because what follows is Frank arrives at this hotel where it's clearly not a friendly place. There's very few people there. He's told the hotel is closed. And there's somebody upstairs who never comes out of his room, who turns out to be this gangster, Johnny Rocco. Frank meets the owner of the hotel, James Temple, who is the father of his war buddy, and the widow of his war buddy, Nora Temple, played by Lauren Bacall. And what I think is especially notable about this is that because of what that opening screen crawl tells us, this is a frontier. This is on the edge, literally the edge of the United States. And what plays out wouldn't be out of place in a Western. This is, as you say, it's got aspect. You see Bogart and Bacall, and for that matter, Edward G. Robinson, who plays Johnny Rocco, the gangster. And you probably do think, okay, this is, now we would say that's film noir. At the time, it would have been a matter of this is a type of crime film, which it is, but it also, I think, draws on a lot of other aspects, such as Western. But interestingly, it is also very much a chamber piece because the hotel is where almost all of the action takes place within this hotel because of this hurricane that is, this bombarding them, and it gets pretty. And what's fascinating, therefore, is you get these tensions between the different groups of characters because Rocco has various hoods with him, and a fair amount of time is spent just in single rooms. And Frank and Nora and James Temple, played by Lionel Barrymore, whom I had to look up, say, oh, it's Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life. Again in a wheelchair, but much nicer this time, along with a few other colourful characters, such as various hoods, and Claire Trevor as Gay Dawn. There's a name. All trapped in this space together, and the kind of individual tensions and the wider sort of social tensions. There's lots of references back to prohibition and the crime infrastructure that has created, and the role of a gangster figure within wider American culture. So I find the different elements that go into Key Largo absolutely fascinating, and most of that, and the thing which brings them all together is it's a very aptly named film, named for its location, because that location proves to be very important.
Jimmy, what's your feelings on Key Largo?
So yeah, it was a film I was really like. I started earlier by saying I've barely seen any Lauren Bacall films, or in my opinion. Turns out all three that we have done today were the three I've seen. So I got to kind of see them with a new light. So Key Largo was a film that was given to me by my grandma and granddad, my nan and granddad. Sorry, they gave me the Bacall and Bogart box set, and I watched it for the first time with my other grandma. So this is about 10 years ago I watched this. And at the time I remember just being like, I love Edward G. Robinson. That was my relationship to this film, as I'd watched Double Indemnity. And then since then I'd watched Little Caesar, and Edward G. Robinson was like the guy for me. So the first time I watched it 10 years ago, I was like, yeah, Bogart's great, but Edward G. Robinson's having a riot. And I really enjoyed this film. What's been really great about rewatching the three films, and especially Key Largo, with an eye on Lauren Bacall, is you sort of see it in a slightly different light. So 10 years ago, and this is the joy of Letterboxd, as you go through and see what you used to think. And I wrote that Lauren Bacall was a little understated. And I read that now and I was like, I can't believe that's what I thought, because I think she's so good in this film, right? I think she's like, you watch it this time, and yes, Edward G. Robinson is like chewing and spitting his way through it, and Bogart has this really interesting moral conflict, which I didn't pick up on as much when I was like 18, 19, but his journey from sort of like moral grey post-war into what becomes like, firstly, slight acts of heroism, like with when he helps Claire Trevor with a drink, I think is such a beautiful moment in this film, and then obviously the we get this big finish. But what's really clear to me is that Lauren Bacall's like the heartbeat of this film. She's not understated. She's playing it brilliantly. Especially because after this film I went and watched To Have and To Have Not, her debut, and she's so like, it's such a charismatic and big performance that it makes me appreciate her Key Largo performance even more, because she plays it really quiet, really internal. And my thoughts on Key Largo this time were, it's a Riot, it's a great chamber piece, it's one of the better play adaptations I've ever seen. I think John Huston cinematically imagines a lot, but like Lauren Bacall's like a star in this movie, and does it without grabbing the headlines. And I think that's a pretty like great way of showing her range, maybe, is how I felt.
Yeah, I would go with that. It's like not the movie star performance that you get in something like The Big Sleep, where when Lauren Bacall is on screen, you do not care about anyone else. But there's a thoughtfulness to it. There's an underpinning to it. There's a sense that if it wasn't for her, a lot of the characters in this, particularly Frank, the Bogart character, would have less of a stake in the story, because, as you say, you come into it, he's burned out. The war is such a huge thing in Key Largo, and I don't just mean that in the sense that Frank McCloud is an army veteran and, you know, that knowing what he's probably gone through feeds into how we see him, but there's almost this kind of Brechtian sense of the gangster as a fascist figure in it, that there are scenes where, you know, people talk about ancient evils and ancient ills, which is not traditionally the way that people in gangster movies talk, but there's a sense that, you know, Johnny Rocco's return is really the return of a lot of other things, the return of Prohibition-era gangsterism, perhaps even the return of fascism. And I think Bacall's...
I would just say it's very grand terms for a bootlegger, isn't it? Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know, he's not Milton's Satan, but, you know, somehow they do see him in those terms. And I think, you know, Bacall has to represent the light to that. And she does it while remaining human. You know, there's a lot of great movies which are marred by the fact that they only see their female lead as something that the male lead has to attain. But Lauren Bacall's character in here is someone who can be desired but is also real. You know, she's not just a symbol of the better life, a symbol of the more civilized life. She always has a kind of a cunning and a smarts in her screen persona that is brought out very well here. Not least when you have the classic Bogart and Bacall scene where they just sort of meet each other and talk in weird Hays Code friendly innuendo for a bit about how it really is hotter down here in the Keys, isn't it? And it's a star vehicle in the sense that if you like Bacall or Bogart or Robinson, it's just like tick, 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 here is everything I want to see these three do. But there's a sort of realness to it and an idiosyncrasy to it that goes beyond that.
Yeah, there's a weird new Hollywood connection. Well, editing is one thing, and the other thing is Joe Pesci, which it's clear as day that he is a big fan of Edward G. Robinson because they are basically the same archetype.
Yeah,
by and large,
definitely.
But the new Hollywood thing is like a famous. Like, I think he worked with Scorsese a lot. Walter Murch and his sort of book.
Coppola's guy.
Coppola.
He was Francis Ford Coppola's big.
His editing theory, very new Hollywood. And when you think of old 40s movies, you don't really consider the editing. There's a term that he called dragnet editing, where one person talks and then the next person talks, and it just sort of cuts whenever somebody's finished talking. A lot of 1940s movies do that. They just, somebody talks, cameras on them, next person talks, cameras on them, so on and so forth. In this, the editing's very modern for a movie from 1948. It doesn't feel its age. And editing is one of those sort of tricks that it uses to pull that off, I think.
I think that part of what's in its DNA, and this is something that's in probably all film noir, but especially strongly here, is the late silent movie era, is German Expressionism. This has Karl Freund as its cinematographer. He was the man who shot Metropolis. So when it starts to get stormy, and it does start to get stormy, it doesn't feel like someone is rattling the windows of a studio set, even though at this age of Hollywood, that's what it is. It's a battering, It feels real that way.
Because it's too late to be early talky. It's an established era at this point, but still, this era, it was very, especially with film noir, it was very literary. It was very stage-like. Yeah. And for its era, this most certainly isn't. Like you say, that hotel, it's a good a method that keeps people in one location, and the chamber piece. There's a storm outside, but you can have a lot of movies that do this in sort of an abstract. They'll just have like some sound design. It's a storm outside. Can't you hear it? And there's no sort of visual anything visual going on. But yeah, it keeps the movie moving when every room they're in kind of gets destroyed after a certain while. It keeps momentum up. It's sort of a self-editing.
What you're saying there about the aspects of the dynamism, if you like, of what's going on in the various rooms, ties into one of the thematic concerns, I think, in the film. Going back to what Jimmy said, I would say actually that Bacall is understated in this, and appropriately so, because much of the film is quite understated. I always felt that when it's there within the hotel, I think it's at its strongest, and then in the final act it moves out onto a boat, and for my money that's when it kind of succumbs to genre requirements. But when it's within the hotel, it's got some interesting ideas on, I think, legacy that we've mentioned, and also on forms of resistance. Because what's fascinating is that you've got Bogart there as Frank being, you sort of expecting him to be more tough guy, more bogey-esque, but he isn't. And what we actually see through quite a lot of the film is kind of a non-violent resistance. And I think, and the way that Bacall is understated, I think plays into that as well. It's all quite restrained, which I think is interesting because of them being in this contained space with a hurricane battering them. Rocco, Robinson's character, is far more aggressive, far more flamboyant. As you said, Jimmy, he's chewing his way through the scenery. And at some points he's coming across like he's sort of almost defying or raging against the storm. He's not necessarily old, but middle-aged man shouting at clouds here. And I think that's part of their dynamic, that he is a man of action, a man of violence. But the characters we are sided with, Frank and Nora, are not. They are, as I say, far more restrained, far more passive, because they understand the futility raging against this kind of violence. So I think that the different elements of the setting and the performance styles and the way the characters are written, and it all ties together into a really nice combination, and it's really nice atmospheric amalgam of crime and western and chamber piece that's interested in different forms of resistance.
It's really interesting when you say that as well, because then you add in like Lionel Barrymore's character, who is like very vocally resistant and wants to be resistant, but who is caged by his the problems with his health as well. And that makes for another interesting dynamic of someone who's raging against the machine but can't do anything about it. I think that scene where he does try to get up to strike Rocco and falls is really striking, when you've got like Bogart is mobile and able to move through scenes, and he's able to step to and step between. And then you've got someone who's literally falling over trying to do what I guess the audience is shaking everyone to do. And yeah, I think you're right. I think that all of that complements really well. I do just think it's a riot. It's a great film, and functions as I said, I watched it with my grandma, loved it. I can talk about it with you guys for 20 minutes. It's great. It functions in both ways. which is pretty sweet.
Yeah.
Is another female role, as Vincent highlighted, the Gay Dawn character, which, as I understand it, is actually an award-winning turn for Claire Trevor, as she won a Best Supporting Actor award, I think, at the Academy Awards. But that's an interesting character, because that's not something you typically got in that sort of time. You got, because her character's essentially she's an alcoholic. Her best days are behind her, and she's basically leeching off Johnny Rocco, which is the most 1940s name, by the way, Johnny Rocco. And that's the sort of perspective you got on these sort of dance hall singers that you only really get in sort of neo-noir or movies that look back in this era with a bit of cynicism.
A more jaundiced kind of yeah.
And they
Well, we're
get it
talking
at the
here.
peak.
Yeah, I mean, it's 2 years before Sunset Boulevard, which obviously
Sunset
really leans
Boulevard,
into that aspect.
Sweet Smell of Success.
Yeah.
These sorts of movies that have got a real chip on their shoulder. And it's an interesting character in a... It kind of gets lost amongst all the sort of the big starry performances from the lead three, but that is it's a very colourful performance that just adds that little bit of extra texture that I think it peers at this time certainly we're a bit afraid of. I mean, look at the next movie. That wasn't for another decade, and that probably couldn't have happened at this time either.
It's one of those Best Supporting award Oscar-winning performances as well, where you can pinpoint the exact scene which won the Oscar, and it's where they force her to sing before they'll allow her to have a drink, and it's this fantastically, like, not a moment of violence in that scene, but it's fantastically sadistic, and she is so frightened and uncertain about how the situation's going to go. You know, you mentioned Joe Pesci, Rob. It does have that kind of energy that he brings to things like Goodfellas and Casino, where you do not know when the violence is going to erupt into the scene. I think it's a really cruel and memorable scene.
Yeah, the Joe Pesci thing, he did it without... Joe Pesci shouted a lot, whereas Edward G. Robinson, in this at least, he's incredibly threatening, but he never really raises his voice. It's a remarkable performance from him, I think.
It's notable, I think, that what we could say about... I mean, I do feel that although Bacall is appropriately understated, but what's interesting is, although she doesn't get to a big showy performance like Claire Trevor does, she is very much... This is going to sound... There's a weird tension here. She is simultaneously literally in the background, and yet kind of foregrounded anyway, which I think goes back to what I think Graham mentioned earlier. She is like the heart. Maybe she's the heart, and Frank is the soul. The dynamic there is used by keeping her in frame, even when she's not necessarily moving the action. And it's used, and it's interesting to think about looking at these three films from different stages in her career. She definitely comes across here as here is a young woman, not girl per se. She's she's a widow. She's clearly been living there. She's seen some things, but very much she is, I'd say, well, certainly the youngest member in the cast. And despite that, she still appears to have a kind of an age beyond her years.
No, it was. I didn't know when to make this point exactly, and I don't know if it's going to come across how I wanted to. But like, I think when you hear the name Lauren Bacall and like you think of the star, the name, right, and it's really great that we've kind of picked three films which not really like outright the lead in all three. I find she's a very generous performer. Like I love Marlene Dietrich, but every Marlene Dietrich film I watch, I'm like only talking about Marlene Dietrich. In all three of these, there's room to talk about everyone else, and I'm not talking about Bogart and Robertson. I'm talking about, as you say, Claire Trevor, and like in Written on the Wind, you can talk about Dorothy Malone, which we'll come on to. It was also an Oscar winner for the supporting role. And that's what I found really great about these three films. But talking about Key Largo here, is she's so good, but it's without taking it away from anyone else. And I know you could probably say that for Bogart and Robinson, but like, it really is impressive here how you get an ensemble when you could just be talking about the three.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to say, sort of jokingly aside, is it's just the Toots character. It's very interesting. Tootsie, is that what he's called? He's basically the young man who's got his tie tucked into his pants.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is a thing which has aged him more than anything, I think. But it's just the idea of the gangsters, sort of the guy who fights for the gangster, the muscle, whatever you want to call him. It's just such a interesting thing, looking at how it's evolved over time. This is what passed for it in the 40s. This young, pretty guy, very nicely dressed. It's really interesting, I think. A sort of evolution of history through tough guys.
They're always the great heavies, though. They're always the great heavies, though, aren't they? The ones who don't appear to be a threat. So when they come in and everyone's scared of them, you think, oh, this guy must really be able to handle himself because he doesn't look like anything.
Yeah, you never get that moment either, unfortunately, but it just is what it is. Any closing thoughts on Key Largo before we move on to Written on the Wind?
One thing I'll say in terms of its very much of its time, but I think it's worth pointing out, the worst thing for me on this film is it's pretty racist in its representation of Native Americans. That, every, in big scare quotes, Indian character dresses in this kind of traditional way and speaks at most broken English. So I think it's unfortunate. It does again tie into the Western trope that this film has, and yeah, I mean, I do feel though it's a bit of a cop out to say, well, it was of its time, and I think, yeah, in its time it was racist, just like it is now. However, despite all that, there is this odd moment right at the end when Lionel Barrymore's character James Temple, he says, it's like even when we try to help these people, we still end up hurting them after a couple of guys have been killed by the local. But oh well, there's something realistic about it, of course. The sheriff shot at the Native Americans and asked questions. Well, never. So that was an odd inclusion that I felt was. I'm not going to say it's progressive, but it is interesting. It does show some variation.
It's not necessarily progressive, but it's aware of the situation. It's aware of the circumstances. It's not as bad as some of the movies that represent Native Americans at that time, which were so offensive and can't be seen by anybody in today's light. And this is offensive, but at the same time, at least there's somewhat of a human representation of them, rather than just the cartoon racist stereotypes.
There's an attempt to take it into a more progressive message that Vincent mentions at the
more
end.
More nuanced engagement.
Yeah.
Jimmy, any final thoughts on Key Largo?
I guess all I would add is I do think for a film that's shot on a backlot, like its sense of place is great. I think it's got a really strong sense of place. And I really do love that about it. I don't know if it's with the text you get before, but I feel like you know exactly where you are. And again, I just shout out John Huston for doing a great job of like a chamber pieces, and especially things. I'm pretty sure it was adapted from a playwright. They can sometimes be quite stuffy and lifeless. And I think, as you heard us talk about, it's anything but. And I think that's a standard for play adaptations that I wish existed even now, that I don't think you get all the time.
I'll have you. Marriage or no marriage.
I'm in love with you, so much so that I want to marry you.
Universal International presents Rock Hudson as Mitch Wayne, who owed everything to the oil-rich Hadleys. Lauren Bacall, who had married Kyle Hadley too soon. Robert Stack as headstrong Kyle Hadley. Dorothy Malone as Kyle's sister. In a tense, frank drama woven of the raw realism of life itself.
Yes, moving to 1956 now with Douglas Sirk, Written on the Wind, which I seem to recall that Jimmy is a big fan of. So, what is Written on the Wind, Jimmy?
Yeah, it is one of my favourite films of all time. I love it. I'll do the IMDb one as well, which is alcoholic playboy Kyle Hadley, played by Robert Stack, marries the woman marries the woman, which is Lauren Bacall, secretly loved by his poor but hardworking best friend Rock Hudson, who in turn is pursued by Kyle's, does say nymphomaniac sister, which doesn't feel great for IMDb, but sure. It's a Douglas Sirk melodrama, and Douglas Sirk made these incredibly cynic soap operas that function beautifully as like quote unquote weepies. I think at the time they were literally called for like women's movies, but they are cynical takedowns of the American dream, and I find them the most melodramatic, entertaining films. I fell in love with them at uni, and this was my fourth viewing of Written on the Wind. I'd love to, like, I don't know how much we're going to spoil it for people. I would, for anyone who hasn't watched the film, I would just go in blind and go on a ride, like grab a beer, grab some popcorn, grab whatever you like, and just go with it. But yeah, it's everything moves at breakneck speed. So Rock Hudson meets Lauren Bacall. They're chatting, and Rock Hudson introduces them to his best friend Playboy, played by Robert Stack. And within 10 minutes, Robert Stack and Laura Bacall are married. And Rock Hudson is secretly pining for her, while Dorothy Malone, who is Robert Stack's sister, is pining for Rock Hudson. And you end up with this wild, I don't know, like entangled love triangle on love triangle. And yeah, I don't know how much you want me to spoil it, but I'd love people to.
Not the ending, because that's a big moment, isn't it? But all I'll say about the ending is it just made me think so much. I can't remember the name of the character, but it's the love interest in Kind Hearts and Coronets. Blonde woman. It just, the vibes, they're so similar. I'm not going to delve into that deeper because huge spoilers for both movies. Yeah, I was just gonna my problem with Written on the Wind is I'd never know where to start. I guess I'll start with Lauren Bacall, who again is like Rock Hudson plays this very steely, like almost like a fixer. Like in a way, he's like Eddie Maddox and Hail Caesar. Like he is the guy who solves all the problems for this Playboy family. And Lauren Bacall comes in and is like the opposite of everyone's quite like rich and flamboyant, and she's like, just give Robert Stack a chance. That's like, she sees something in him that no one else sees. Like Robert Stack's Playboy he's looked down on by his father, he's looked down on by his sister. In a way, Rock Hudson supports him, but even then, it's like when you've got a friend who you're like, oh yeah, he's like that though. And Lauren Bacall meets him and finds something in him that no one else sees, and is like asking everyone to take this man seriously, to give him a chance. And she does such a wonderful job of being like the sort of normal person in this mad movie, to the point where, as I said, I think this is my fourth viewing, and this is probably the first time I've watched it and thought about Lauren Bacall, because there's so much else going on. There's so much else going on that's like headline grabbing stuff. And it was great to watch this film and be like, Lauren Bacall is doing such like underappreciated work in this. She's really like keeping everything quite well for this film fairly normal. She's like bringing the heart again. She's bringing the stakes, and it was great to watch her in this world. For me, Graham, yourself.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I must say, I wish I was as in love with it as much as Jimmy is. I wish I was in love with anything as much as Jimmy is with this movie. But my experience with Douglas Sirk is that I'd only ever seen one of his films, and it was Shockproof, which is a very atypical film for him. I mean, if you want to know how atypical, it's scripted by Sam Fuller, who I think is
wow.
a slightly different authorial voice.
The man of Shock Corridor and White Dog.
That guy. Yeah, yeah. It's not a great film, Shockproof, but it's an interesting clash of sensibilities. I do think it's worth watching. So I'm going into this kind of knowing from a sort of pop culture osmosis level what its deal is. I found it kind of hard to get much of a baseline on it. There are parts of it that are really nakedly emotional, and I think these will strike everyone. And there are parts of it where it is very arch. It feels like it's in inverted commas, or perhaps that I felt like I had to approach it in those terms because I had no real reference points for this kind of melodrama outside of camp, which I don't think is quite sufficient. So I was all over the shop with it. It fluctuated from scene to scene as to whether I could make much of a connection with it. I think Dorothy Malone is definitely giving the most performance in it, and I think she is immensely fun in it. Rock Hudson, who I'm normally very fond of, I couldn't get much of a bead on his performance here, but I think, as you say, Bacall is very strong, and this is her in full-on movie star mode. You know, when you watch her in the noirs, you really you have to re-enter a mindset where these were originally Humphrey Bogart vehicles, and then everyone sat down and they're like, wow, who's that girl with Humphrey Bogart? And the legend develops from there. But this is like 10 years after The Big Sleep. She is a firmly established star. It is one of those star roles where every shot she is in is framed to like show off this incandescent movie star to full advantage. I think the only thing that I am really bothered by with her performance is that there is a suggestion. It's when she's wearing that sort of Madame X dress, the black dress with the sort of low-cut front, and there is an implication that she can be wooed by a man playing a ukulele, which I do not believe for 1 second. I think that is outright fantasy. So yeah, I felt really discombobulated by it. I'm curious to watch more Cirque and see if it throws me for a loop like this, but this was a very, very odd experience for me because there is craft to it. You can't deny that there is a lot of craft to it. These films look gorgeous. He has a great sense of atmosphere again after Key Largo and its very evocative storm. There's this lovely shot early on where you see an interior, but you see it through a pane of glass and you see all the leaves hitting the window because the wind's being whipped up, and it's got that lovely sense of like it's a beautifully composed, rich person's interior, but there's all this stormy passion outside it. Lovely stuff like that. I could not quite make it add together to me, but there is enough in it to make me think that's probably a me thing.
Vincent?
I wouldn't say it's entirely a you thing, Graham, because I get what you mean. I've seen very little Douglas Sirk as well. And I will say, actually, all three of these films, this was my first time seeing them. And I think it's notable that it does have that interesting connection to Key Largo, aside from Bacall, in terms of, there are points where you've got the elements, as it were, battering against the human habitation. And there are points when the door into this grand, opulent mansion bursts open and leaves do blow in. So I think that's a fairly It's a nice metaphor for the kind of the raging emotion that's going on beneath the surface, and not always so beneath. Yes, it can be described as seeming a bit, well, it is similar perhaps to camp, but I don't think it is camp itself. I described this film as being gorgeously styled and melodramatically overcranked, which is something of a tautology because melodrama is supposed to be overcranked anyway. But despite that, it still plays as something genuine. What I think we have in these two love triangles, or maybe it's a love diamond, I'm not sure, is we're seeing very toxic relationships. The relationship between Mitch, Rock Hudson's character, and Kyle, played by Robert Stack, is one of mutual. It's one of codependence, but also it's mutually destructive. And then Lucy, played by Lauren Bacall, coming into this is a kind of a disruption, while also she simultaneously disrupts things further while providing an odd sort of, I don't want to say stalemate, but balance, shall we say. And then Dorothy Malone's character, Mary Lee, is adding a further disruption. So it's very insistent, I think, upon the idea of these different relationships and the desires, the unfulfilled desires, and especially in the case of Kyle, but also Mitch, very much a sense, I think, of unfulfilled masculinity. Both of them have an idea of the kind of man they are supposed to be, and Kyle is disappointed everyone around him, and I think he's got a deep self-loathing, and Mitch has a similar self-loathing precisely because he rewards the expectations of everyone around him but doesn't do what he actually wants. And to have and for Bacall to be playing this figure between them, and she could so easily, I think, have been objectified, and I don't feel she is. She comes across as a character in her own right with agency, who's able to take part in what's going on, and I think she kind of sees what's happening, but she's not just seeing what's happening, but she's also too involved in it to sort of rebel against it. And I will say it's interesting that we say we don't want to spoil it, but notably, the film opens with the climax. We start with Kyle driving clearly very drunk back to the house, and we see Mitch looking out the window with Lucy in the background, and it becomes clear, uh-oh, here he comes. This isn't going to go well. And then we get a gunshot. And okay, we don't see everything that happens, but we know it's not going to, this is a violent situation. And then, of course, we flash back. But what I think is notable here is, yes, this is a melodrama. Yes, it could be a weepy. It could be I'm sure it was at the time marketed as a woman's picture, in scare quotes. But it's also a tragedy. And tragedy because we get this prologue in the Shakespearean or ancient Greek quality that says, this is what's going to happen. Buckle up, kids. And then it sticks. And then it's very much about showing this downward spiral through these toxic relationships and unfulfilled masculinity. And I'm so glad, Graham, you highlighted the framing, because that was something that struck me about this. The framing of this movie is so potent. Douglas Sirk absolutely knew how to use the language of cinema and of cinematography and mise en scène to convey, to present, and while at the same time present something that looks perfectly composed, but you can feel the throbbing energy underneath it.
That was a very lusty pronunciation.
Yeah,
throbbing.
That was great.
As soon as I said throbbing, I thought people are going to make that sexual, aren't they? Yep. Okay. Well, never mind.
The film is sexual. It's fine. Like,
absolutely.
For me, like, clearly I love Sirk, and I do. I think All That Heaven Allows is also an amazing film, and Imitation Life, Magnificent Obsession. There's one with Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck. But he reunites those two from Double Indemnity in this incredible film that name I slightly forget. But like the thing about Cirque is, like, to me, you get these sequences or these images that are just like peak cinema. And in this, it's when Dorothy Malone's character is brought back by the police, and she's gone out to get arrested for attention. I think is the implication. She comes back in and goes straight upstairs, and her father interrogates the man she was arrested with, and he was like, "She picked me up," and that's when he learns that Dorothy Malone's like very much sleeping around town, which to him is the worst thing in the world. Like, to me, it's like, who cares? But anyway, like, and you get this amazing.
It was the
sequence.
50s.
Yeah, it was the 50s, right? So like you get this amazing sequence where she goes upstairs, she puts on a song, she starts dancing, she changes into this red dress as her father staggers up the stairs and has a heart attack, and he falls down the stairs while she's dancing. Rock Hudson catches him, and then Lauren Bacall comes out and screams. And to me, that's just like maximum emotional drama that you basically can't get anywhere else. Cirque is so committed. He's so committed to making you feel stuff. And as someone who watches films for the emotional connection and to feel stuff, I find his films are so committed. And they might be cynical, and they might, like, underneath this surface, they might be interrogating some really real and like grounded and sometimes awful stuff, like the toxic masculinity, the vulnerability of Robert Stack's character, of not, of where that goes in his performance. It really means something to me. But also, he's just so committed. And I would love, like, I talked about this all the time, I'd love Melodrama to make a proper comeback. I'd love to see stars having this much fun. They're not playing it. Like, they're not, it's not, I'm really going off it, but like, since, Marvel and stuff, everyone's like in on the joke. Everyone's playing it with a wink. And these guys are not playing it with a wink. They are playing it for real. And it is so refreshing in a strange way. And I think that's why, for me, it works. And Lauren Bacall keeps them so grounded. I really do. I think she brings like this grounding to it. And she's so real in this heightened way that it allows Dorothy Malone to go and have like the most fun she's probably ever had in a film. And Robert Stack to really ham it up and get an Oscar nomination. And yeah, I understand it's not be for everyone, but I've not had the chance to talk about Cirque and Written on the Wind in a long time. So I've taken that chance.
Just a quick aside. I'd seen, as I say, I hadn't seen much Bacall, and I'd seen even less Rock Hudson, but I'd seen a lot of Robert Stack, just not in the movies. I remember him from when he was the host of Unsolved Mysteries. Oh, and of course he's in Airplane.
That's so cool. Yes, of course. Yeah.
But it was interesting to see him in a role like this, being so vulnerable and being such a mess.
This is a bit tangential, but I really like this. I never expected to, I'll be honest. But there's one thing that really stood out for me, and I'm going to take a left turn here. It sounds like I'm rambling, but there's a thing I love about Seijun Suzuki movies. He did Branded to Kill, all these sort of very maximalist sort of 1960s and 70s Japanese gangster movies, and the thing that really unifies them and really stands out in my mind with them is the fact that they use a jazz soundtrack. And when everything you see has classical music or rock music or electronic music, when you hear something it isn't being a taste that isn't being satisfied, you think, ooh, this is interesting. So it's kind of related to what Jimmy was saying. You don't get this sort of thing. So when you get something appealing to a part of the cinematic landscape that just isn't there, you think, never seen something like this. This is ticking or scratching an itch that I didn't know I really had. And it's an interesting experience, I think.
There is a scene in this where someone appears to be knocked down a flight of stairs by jazz. Like, not by being physically struck in any way, just the jazz knocks them down the stairs.
Yeah, but it's a different style, a different rhythm than is really being catered to since, I guess, the 1950s. These things haven't really... Maybe 1960s. No, I think No, I think the independent spirit kind of killed this sort of thing, really, didn't it? In New Hollywood, completely destroyed it.
I think there's a kind of jazziness. There's certainly jazziness in the French New Wave films. I always think they seem to be edited to a kind of jazz rhythm.
A musical, I can't remember who it was. You did a review of it a few years back, and you said it was one of the best films you've seen.
The Young Girls of Rochefort by Jacques Demy.
Catherine Deneuve, yeah. That's sort of...
Yes.
They're making... Movies, the thing about movies is they all sort of have this pretense of being real. Like, it's representing something which is real. The light doesn't behave like that because it's got to be motivated. Everything's got to be motivated. Everything's got to have this sort of basis in reality. But when you see something, reality doesn't matter. This is just completely stylistically over the top. I really like that sort of stuff.
I always think that's like the artifice, isn't it? It's like especially Sark, I feel like it's the artifice of the American dream. It's the artifice of the ideal life. It's the artifice of the playboy. In All That Heaven Allows, Jane Wyman, it's about like, that film is about an older woman falling in love with Rock Hudson and the taboo of an older woman falling in love with a younger man. And that's all like, you get the perfect living room, the perfect lighting, but underneath it all, everyone's always like something's going on. Someone's unhappy. Someone's yearning for something else. And I think that's what he does better than anyone. He said it's so stylized, it's so over the top, it's so representing something else, and then he interrogates what's underneath it. It's really interesting. He made a film after this where he reunited Rock Hudson, Dorothy Malone, and Robert Stack the year after in a film called The Tarnished Angels, which is about a journalist and his friendship with like daredevil, like airplane riders or like plane riders. So for people who do watch this for the first time, that's quite fun to watch those three play again in a different dynamic. Bacall clearly didn't get the call, or was too expensive for that low budget one, but worth a look.
A pleasant surprise for me, this one, and this is really not in my wheelhouse, and I think that's what shocked me the most, really.
That's great. Yeah. I'd love to hear what you think of the others, if the others hit or if it becomes like a one-off. Like, I always love to hear people's views on it.
Any other thoughts on this one before we move on?
One thing I'll say to follow on from, whereas in the case of Key Largo, Bacall was there very much, I think, as a young woman. Here she is more mature, and I think that's significant, even though it's only 6 years later. And I think she comes across as somebody who is more mature, despite being in some ways could seem still like young and naive. But she always, I think, she was cast because she could hold her own and have the measure of Rock Hudson and Robert Stack, and she absolutely does throughout.
That's a great point.
You know, the man you say you are was my brother-in-law. If you were my brother-in-law, you'd say it was impossible for you to be sitting right here in front of me. You didn't believe in life after death, and that mind, soul, spirit, whatever you want to call it, disappears.
I'm right here in front of you, Bob.
Am I to understand that 10-year-old boy that came to my birthday party, unannounced, uninvited, is now claiming, told you, that he was your late husband, Sean? Are you telling me this little boy is now sending letters to you telling you not to marry Joseph?
What I can tell you is that I love Anna. I love her very much. And I want to marry her.
Well, who the hell is he?
He says he's Sean. Don't bother me again.
There's a boy this tall who wants to marry my fiancée.
Look, you can think whatever you want. Everybody can think what they want. I'm who I say I am. I'm Sean. I love Anna, and I'm her husband.
I can't get him out of my system. I can't.
You ask Anna who she loves more, me or Joseph.
And now we're at the final movie of the show, and we jump forward some decades from 1956 to 2004 with Jonathan Glazer. Pretty early on in his career. I think it'd have been post... brain farted.
Sexy Beast?
Yeah, post Sexy Beast, so his second feature, I believe.
Very different than Sexy Beast and Under the Skin and Zone of Interest. But it is Birth. And Graham, you said you had something for this, so...
Yeah. This is the one I feel together enough to recap. I think largely because Birth's plot is just a series of questions, and I think it's one of the interesting things about it is for a film that is so mysterious, and I'm sure we'll talk about the mysteries of it and our own pet theories about it. It has almost like a high concept hook, which is that Nicole Kidman plays a woman called Anna. Her husband is out jogging on a very cold New York morning, and he drops dead. And then 10 years later, she is on the verge of remarrying a bumptious oaf played by Danny Houston, but I repeat myself. And a small child meets her and says that he is in fact Sean. He is the reincarnation of her husband, that he was born at the moment that he died, and now his soul is alive inside him, and he would like to return to her life. And it's it unfolds in ways that are very interesting, I think, because we've talked a lot about how in all of these movies Lauren Bacall is a kind of steadying presence, a sort of a mediating presence, a person who other people look to when they need some sort of sense of what's at stake and what matters in life. And she is in here as well. She is absolutely the voice of reason in Birth. The difference is, and the reason why I think it's such a destabilising film, is that absolutely no one wants to listen to her. And I think it plays very well with what I think is the usual flaw of movies that have this kind of, is this supernatural or is it not premise, which is that, of course you want it to be supernatural. No one ever goes in to see a movie about reincarnation and thinks, God, I hope no one gets reincarnated in this movie. It's just the natural movie-going desire to want to see something that's a bit fantastical and a bit outside of everyday life. And I think one of Glazer's skills is that he is very good at not putting you in the same position as his characters, not through making you relate to them necessarily, but through what he films. You know, Under the Skin is a movie about what it is like to look at Scarlett Johansson, whether that's looking at Scarlett Johansson because she's in a van and she's asked you for directions, or because she's a movie star and you're a moviegoer. And I think Birth is a movie about what it's like to really want to believe that this child is the reincarnation of Anna's husband. And you sympathise with Anna a lot, and after a while you think, oh no, wait, you've gone off the deep end. This is completely mad. You think a 10-year-old boy is your husband. You know, what are you talking about? But you can't condemn her because you were sat there wanting the same thing. And I think that's part of why it's such a distinctively unsettling film.
That's very different than my take.
Interesting.
Go on.
Because honestly, I was sort of blinded by my hate for such a precocious 10-year-old. Just his mannerisms. There's a scene when Danny Houston tries to beat him up, and
yes.
I thought,
he doesn't beat him up. He tries to spank him.
Yes. It's just the smugness of because it's like a 10-year-old. It's just his smugness is just, it completely upends everything, I feel. I mean, it's like a 10-year-old who's acting like an investment banker, and it's just so jarring an experience. when you say precocious kids act like adults, it's kind of like they're smart, or they use words that they maybe shouldn't in their vocabulary. But this kid, he has this quite cool sort. When I say cool, I don't mean like Humphrey Bogart or Joe Shishido in a Seiji Suzuki movie. I mean, cool is in sort of very detached and morose sort of way of expressing himself. But he's 10, and he's talking like this. I thought, you little... Oh my God. Made me quite angry, I'll be honest.
What's fascinating is both the responses that Graham and Robert described, and I'll agree with this, perhaps Jimmy with as well. Both of you sounded like this was a film that made you uncomfortable, if in different ways.
Annoyed, honestly.
Yeah. But that was my reaction as well. I mean, let's say again, my first time watching Birth, and I thought it was fantastic. It absolutely blew me away. And one of the reasons it blew me away is that I felt it was so deeply uncomfortable because, as you were saying, Graham, you're like, what are you doing, woman? Anna, Nicole Kidman, this is so fucked up. And yet at the same time, I didn't condemn her. No, you're absolutely right. I was kind of understanding her while also thinking, no. But also, I see what you mean, Rob, saying that kid is aggravating and unsettling and discomforting. I like you say he's sort of this cold remoteness, which perhaps ties back to what Graham mentioned about the way Glazer would use Scarlett Johansson in Under the Skin. Again, she's playing someone who is very cool, very detached, and also playing with expectations of what we know about what we expect with genre, because this is a film about reincarnation, kind of, maybe. And Under the Skin, this is a film about an alien on Earth, but not the way you might expect. And I've not seen Sexy Beast, but the zone of interest is, yes, this is a Holocaust film, not what you might expect. And maybe Sexy Beast does a similar thing with crime. But I think everything that's going on in Birth is there to unsettle and to challenge expectations. At least I think that's what we've said. Perhaps Jimmy has a different perspective.
So it's really interesting to me that I've talked about rewatching a lot. Like, I do feel films are about experiences and where you meet them in different parts of your life. But for like the last 10 years, basically, I've rarely rewatched stuff. I'm always chasing like the new, because I feel there's so many films I haven't seen. Over the last year or two, I've started to rewatch the films that I watched at uni for the first time. So I watched Birth 2015, and I liked it, but it's not a film I've thought about a lot. I watched it this afternoon, and like I was overwhelmed by how moved I was by it. I think the first time I watched it, I'm so caught on the hook, about a boy being reincarnated and about that relationship, and probably about feeling uncomfortable. And not that uncomfortability wasn't there, but this time I was so moved by its exploration of grief and like eternal love that I just thought this film is now one that's going to stay with me for a really long time. Whereas before, it's not one I've thought about a lot. I think it looks incredible. It sounds incredible. And I think back in 2015, when I first watched it, I wanted those films to show me the subjective experience. And that's what moved me, is being with a character. And Glazer doesn't always allow you to be with. You're sort of, at times you're removed. And I don't know what happened. I don't know what's happened in my last 9 years, whatever, since I watched it. But I was overwhelmed by its explorations of grief. I think there's the scene, and I hope it doesn't spoil it too much, but where the young boy is talking to Anna's friend or former friend, and she says, "You can't be Sean, because if you were Sean, you'd have come to me first." And that like blew open the film to me. It stops just being about Nicole Kidman's grief and Nicole Kidman's love, and it becomes about someone else's grief and someone else's love. And like, it's weird. My takeaway wasn't, the uncomfortability maybe that I felt the first time. I was just aching for these people. So yeah, I was surprised. I was surprised to have been so emotionally invested in this and so emotionally wrought. And now I think it's a film that's going to influence me as a filmmaker for years to come.
That's Yeah, the grief is absolutely right. Yeah, grief is, I think, a paramount aspect to this film. The fact that it starts with a death, and we return literally to the site of that, and we can say clearly that one of the central aspects of the narrative arc is that Anna has not fully moved on from the death of her husband, and nor, for that matter, it turns out, as another character. But as well as grief, I think it's very much tied up with ideas of memory and identity, and love. This is, in some ways, a very twisted love story. And no wonder, therefore, that it is so emotional, because it has this, as well as one of the reasons, again, I think it's so uncomfortable, is that it is unflinching. It has this high concept, perhaps, or what might be considered a high concept, and it sticks to it. But it sticks to it perhaps not in that very inner subjective way, in that it's saying, right, okay, let's take seriously these characters, or at least some of them, taking it seriously. Let's push that idea. Let's see where we go with it. And it goes to some very, and it goes to these very, very interesting, and I think you're absolutely right, these emotionally wrought scenes that, I think it's going to stay with me as well.
Well, it's that thing of like, it asks that universal question of how do we ever move on, right? If you've ever loved or lost, like that's in with the film, and that's why it works. And that's why I think what's really nice about this is they don't spend too long on being like, this premise is ridiculous, right? Because I think as an audience and the people in the film as well, if you've loved and lost, you understand what she's going through. And that's where, like, just to pivot to Lauren Bacall, is why it works so well, is like, she might be trying to be a voice of reason, but she's also very understanding. Like, her screen time's quite limited, but she makes a massive impact in this film, partly probably because she's Lauren Bacall, where you're like, I understand this person has stature. I understand this person has lived the life. We've seen her grow up on screen. So, like, you bring someone like her in to do a role where she's not got loads. Like, if my minor complaint would be like, I could have had more Lauren Bacall. I could watch that character for a really long time. She makes that screen time matter. And I think about that Lauren Bacall moment at the end where she's like, I didn't even like Sean. And it's like, oh, yes, this moment, like, she like nails that bit. And it's just a scene that opens up the film. And I think what Birth does that's great is like, it just feels so big. It feels so small, and then it feels so big. It feels so personal, and then it feels universal. Yeah.
And going back to, again, the comparison with the other two, here we have Bacall of an age. I mean, she must have been about 80 when she did this. And yeah, she's not in it very much, but she does have a presence. She comes across as an elderly woman who has seen plenty and knows how to sort of manage family, as it were, family drama. It's going to be a weird comparison. I've recently watched all 3 seasons of The Bear, in which, spoiler for cameo, Jamie Lee Curtis turns up playing a mother who is just like, if you think you got the mother from hell, check this one out. And Bacall in Birth is the complete opposite of that. Here is a mother and certainly an matriarch, if you will, who is able to manage these dynamics. And yeah, I think that point you made, Jimmy, about the way she interacts with Sean, young Sean, and then speaks about the late Sean, gives this other perspective. I was like, huh, okay. That's providing a balance. And at the same time, I think, as you say, Glazer is playing with the persona of Bacall. She is there as a kind of a calm center, but she's not a calm center that's actually being adhered to. And then when things turn around, she's like, yeah, just not so much just as I thought, but well, everything's back to normal, as it were, kind of, but not, because she's always had this varied perspective. Sorry, that was a bit convoluted.
No, but I think that's true. She is the only one of the cast who you can imagine that her character could go back to normal after this because she is so resilient. Everyone else, lifetime of therapy. They're never getting over this, but she's very different in that way.
Just to add context, it is very interesting in a sort of sense of grief is never recovered from, and the smallest of things can blow a hole in you a mile wide, and it does investigate that pretty movingly, but at the same time there's the elephant in the room of just how close it is to being like on the cusp of paedophilic. It's very close, and that might hit people in the wrong way, I think. There's a bigger picture than that, and it is about sort of how grief is sort of eternal. You don't get over somebody that close to you dying, but at the same time, it stretches that to sort of is it extreme. It's absolute ridiculous extreme, which is an interesting thing to sort of discover. But at the same time, the kid, man, if it was any other kid, I'd have been more invested. But it's just this actor. Oh,
I would say though, I think if it seems like the absolute right way for the kid to be played. If young Sean, because the cold sort of aloofness of him also plays into here as like an adult in a child's body, and the fact that he's again we get back to the idea of he's quite understated, and I think that is absolutely the best way, because if he was anything else, then it would probably be camp. If he behaved childishly, or if he behaved romantically towards Anna, let alone lustfully, then the film would probably be unpalatable or silly. But because he has this aloofness, I think that's part of, again, it's the unflinching aspect of taking it so seriously. And that encourages us to take it seriously, even if, or not, and maybe it's just too much of a barrier.
He is a thought experiment. How terrible would this film be if the kid was 15? Like, it's just a 5-year age difference, but it kills the whole thing. I think the fact that it's a 10-year-old boy, it makes it just absurd enough. Like, in the same way that Carl Freund, like, opens up a way to look at Key Largo, the behind-the-scenes credit that I think helps this make more sense is that the script was worked on by Jean-Claude Carrier. It had existed in a number of drafts, but Carrier did the final draft, and he was a frequent collaborator with Louis Buñuel in his later years. He wrote Belle de Jour and The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. So it's that situation of having this family who were very sort of well-mannered and well-off, but are doing one odd thing, is something that he has returned to over and over again.
What's the Buñuel movie where they're all trapped in one room and they can't leave, but nothing's actually stopping them?
The Exterminating Angel.
Yeah, it has that sort
of... I can't remember if he did that one.
But it has that same sort of normalcy, but just one little thing that's broken.
Yes.
I like that your reaction also, like, sort of, you can then understand how, if you're annoyed by this kid, how must Danny Houston's character be feeling? Not saying you'd go as far as him, but like it sort of makes sense as to, you know, how wild he's going. One thing I thought was interesting as well is, like, when you talk about being uncomfortable, what other than that thing, what I found really uncomfortable is how the absurdity of the premise at one point has them around a table laughing about this woman's dead husband, and that made me so uncomfortable. They're making jokes about, you know, that he's claiming to be Sean, and like they're laughing about it, and knowing what she's going through. I found those scenes so perfectly uncomfortable. Like this view into how, you know, people talk about grief and stuff, and how this premise means people are laughing at her and him, and if anything, it strengthens the, you know, what comes next, you know.
Yeah, there's a stereotype, isn't there, in American indie movies of the New York movie about the family disintegrating and about grief.
Yeah.
It's such a stereotype at this point, and this is probably the most interesting example of that stereotype because it doesn't just approach it as a matter-of-fact thing. It does have some absurdities to it that make it more compelling a story, I guess.
And I do think a lot of that, like, not a lot of that, but some of that nuance comes from Lauren Bacall's character, because that matriarch figure could be having all sorts of quite boring cliche reactions. Like, you could easily see a scene where she's very much encouraging Anna just to get married, and it to be over the top or to be melodramatic. Like, and I know I said she was understated in the first, but she's so understated in this, and she gets this weird balance between like being really understanding but also trying to push her daughter in one way while being quite empathetic. And I think I really felt like I came away from this watch being like, God, I need to see more Lauren Bacall in her later years. It was this, like, I know she's in Dogville, but is this a one-off, or did she have many great roles as she got older? Or is this a case of like, why didn't we have great, I know with, Hollywood and the film industry in general, pretty poor track record of great roles for older women. But I just thought, like, this woman has such screen presence still, such star quality. I'd love to know. I can't wait to discover if there's a few more of her performances in there, because I think she brings so much to this. Like, and again, keeping it grounded in a different way. And I'm getting a lot of like this being on this podcast literally giving me a lot more respect for her as an actor, as a craft person, and yeah, excited to find a bit more.
That leads me to the final two-headed question. Legacy of Lauren Bacall and movies that people should check out, or if there's not enough of a sort of basis to pick from, something that you're looking forward to seeing from her filmography that you haven't caught yet. Vincent?
Well, as I say, I have seen, by preparing for this, I increased the number of Bacall films I'd seen by nearly double. Okay, here's one so I would say of those that I've seen, I mean, obviously The Big Sleep. I think that is the most obvious one that needs to be seen, and absolutely, I think of the three we've spoken about, I completely recommend Birth. Of others that, I mean, the others of hers that I have seen, Misery and Dogville, are both really strong ones to watch. When I was preparing for this, I somehow I started watching the wrong film, because I started watching Harper. And then suddenly thought, wait, is this right? And then I checked the list. Here's behind the scenes, folks. It's like, whoops, wrong one. Written on the Wind is the one in the middle. So Harper is one I'm looking forward to finishing, because I got half an hour in and was like, wait, it's the wrong film. So yes, I'm looking forward to watching the whole of Harper. And I will also highly recommend Dark Passage, which is what Bacall did with Bogart right after The Big Sleep. And it does some really interesting things with identity and vision. So yeah, check out Dark Passage, and I'll be checking out Harper. And because she got her Oscar nomination for it, I will also, I think, make a point of checking out The Mirror Has Two Faces.
Graham?
Yeah, I mean, a huge part of Bacall's legacy is defining that image of the film noir woman, but in a strange way, she isn't like that, really. She was never much of a femme fatale. She was always too sort of grounded and thoughtful for that, and I think
she was the good woman.
3 films... Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So she's not exactly what you think of when you think of a noir woman, but she was so influential on that genre. She was so influential on the idea of the celebrity couple, which I realise is a more sort of barbed legacy, but the Bogart and Bacall years are rightly iconic. In terms of other films to watch, completely second the recommendations for The Big Sleep and Misery, where she has a small but very important role. There's a late period film she did, which I always think of when I think of like her later years, it doesn't quite work, but it's always stuck in my head. A Paul Schrader film called The Walker, where Woody Harrelson is like a sort of high society man about town in Washington, D.C., and he's surrounded by all of these sort of very regal kind of women from American power politics, and Bacall has a very, very big role in that I think she is just perfectly cast for. She does, as they have this regal quality, which not many American actresses have, because, well, British actresses have it because they've all played queens, but Americans never get the chance. So I like that she gets the chance in The Walker to... Yeah, there's a few. When The Walker sees her... Yes, okay, fine. But in The Walker, she gets the chance to do, I guess, the closest thing that America has, which is like a Washington, D.C., like high society politician's wife, and that's great casting. In terms of ones that I would like to see, there's a Robert Altman film that he made just like on the turn of his career when he was starting to go into that period in the 80s where he was still making great films, but he was unbankable, called Health, and it was like the last of his Nashville-style all-star satires, and she's in it with Glenda Jackson and Carol Burnett and James Garner, and I love the idea of Lauren Bacall in a Robert Altman film. I love Robert Altman. Has there ever been a bad performance in a Robert Altman film? I'm struggling to think of one. So, yeah, I would love to see that movie.
And Jimmy?
I think the Graham and Vincent sort of like have given a better view of legacy than I could. I think the only thing I'd add, sort of maybe repeating myself, is it's been great to see a star and watch some of the films where she's in more supporting roles, to see what star quality she brings, but also how well she fits in with an ensemble, which isn't always the case from those big Hollywood stars who, can just demand the screen only. I think her legacy for me at the moment is someone who shares the screen so well and has incredible chemistry with not just Bogart, but other actors as well. I'm looking forward to finally finishing off the Bogart and Bacall set my Nan gave me 10 years ago. So I've got The Big Sleep and Dark Passions lined up. But I think one of my favourite things about stars of this era is there's so much. And it's not just like the big titles. It's you can sort of dip into any of them and you get something from it. Like I said, I've watched like 20 Dietrich films now. And like each one you get Dietrich. So the idea of being able to now being like quite invested in Lauren Bacall, that's what I'm excited for, is the not just those ones, it's the when sort by streaming on Letterboxd and finding one from that not many people have watched and chucking that on because you're sort of in safe hands with her. I think that's what I'm excited for. And to watch The Big Sleep, just so I know what everyone's banging on about. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'm not saying that myself. One of the legendary noir, that one, isn't it? So yeah.
There you go.
Top tier. And I think that draws us to a close for this episode. So Vincent, where can we find yourself online?
Well, you can convince me that you are my departed spouse across social media at Dr. Gain on Instagram, X, Letterboxd, Blue Sky Threads. That's spelled DRGAINE. Please check out my podcast, Invasion of the Poddy People, which you can find on the Not Just for Kids movie club feed, where myself, James, and Russell talk movie news, reviews, and deep dives, as well as recommendations. I write reviews for The Geek Show, and if you go to my blog, Vincent's Views, I post links there to my multiple podcast appearances. Graham, if I wanted to sort of sit out a hurricane in a hotel, how should I get in touch with you to do that?
Firstly, I'm very impressed that your Wi-Fi is still up, but if it is, I'm the regular host of the Geek Show's Pop Screen podcast, where every week we take a deep dive into a different movie, either starring by or about a major recording artist. You can find that on the Geek Show website, along with the articles I regularly write for the Geek Show. We're about to start running the Doctor Who Classic Series Doctor Who reviews that I've been doing over on Patreon are going to be transferred over to the main site, so that's something to watch out for. Other things, I occasionally write for Byline Times, and you can just keep up with me more generally on Instagram at GrahamWFilm and on Letterboxd just by searching for Graham Williamson.
And Jimmy, yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a filmmaker, and you can check out my work at jimmydeanfilm.co.uk. Pretty hard to get a username with Jimmy Dean in, so thank my parents for that one. And yeah, so I make short films, first features in development with the BFI at the moment. Just having to take a bit of time off for health stuff at the moment. So I just wanted to shout out the Geek Show for giving me a platform to still do something creative. While I'm like this, I've been really enjoying writing for them. So some reviews there, but mostly like, it's just the most welcoming community of passionate people. It's a joy to chat films with them. And yeah, thank you again for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for the kind words. Really do appreciate that. I don't know how I can follow that really, but all I'll say is you can find me across social media at Uncut, Robcast, across all of them, even the ones that I've forgotten the password for, so there's them too. And we'll see you for the next 2 episodes to take us out. Next week will be a Fright Fest special, which is one of my favourite episodes of any season because I don't need to have seen anything. My numerous guests do it all for me. And the final one of the series will be Kiyoshi Kurosawa. We're revisiting him to look at his non-horror work, which is just as bountiful as his horror stuff. So until next time, thank you very, very much for listening to the Uncut Network, and we'll see you in the next one.